So now we're going to move on to another major part of the postpartum period, which is the involution of the reproductive organs, and also we're going to talk about the physiological return to a non-pregnant state in terms of some of these body systems that we've talked about previously. So in terms of involution of the reproductive organs, what we're talking about primarily here is the uterus, the vagina, cervix, and breasts in women who are not actively breastfeeding or not lactating. Now, involution of the uterus involves three major processes. Number one, we've got contraction of the uterus. Now, the contraction of the uterus is happening actually with that third stage of labor. So once the placenta is delivered, we have a significant amount of contraction going on in order to clamp down on those uterine arteries and try to control the blood loss from those uterine arteries when the placenta detaches. Okay. We also see a considerable amount of contraction of the uterus that goes on beyond that immediate postpartum period. The contractions are often called after pains, and they can be quite intense, and they especially in the first 12 to 24 hours, but they gradually diminish over the next 4 to 7 days, and they tend to actually be stronger in multiparous women. So in women who have had multiple babies over the course of time, those after pains actually tend to be stronger. We also have the process of involution of the uterus also involves the autolysis of myometrial cells. That myometrial layer went under a considerable amount of hyperplasia and hypertrophy during pregnancy. So we've got to kind of get rid of some of those muscle cells. So that autolysis really involves the autodigestion of intracellular proteins and the autodigestion of actual cells in order to reduce that myometrial mass back down to a non-pregnant state. And then we also have to regenerate that interior epithelium, that endothelial lining, which has really been pretty much removed as a process of labor. So starting around 2 to 3 days postpartum, you get the remaining decidua, the remaining decidual cells of pregnancy differentiate into two basic layers, differentiate into a superficial layer and a basal layer. And this superficial layer really provides a barrier to infection. It's actually not unlike a scab, this superficial layer. Okay? Because this superficial layer, which covers and protects this basal layer, is actually eventually going to slough off. We're going to talk about the discharge of the postpartum period, what we call lochia. And so eventually this superficial layer is going to die and get sloughed off with that lochial flow. But underneath it, this basal layer is the source of the new endometrium. Okay. So we get regeneration of the epithelial layer, and that takes about 2 to 3 weeks. And that the site of the placenta actually takes a little longer to heal. It takes about 6 to 7 weeks to fully regenerate. Okay. So eventually the superficial layer will be left behind, and we'll be left with a brand new endothelial layer. So immediately after delivery, the uterus weighs about 1,000 grams, and it's sitting somewhere between, so at delivery, it's sitting somewhere between the umbilicus and the pubis. Okay. So over the next 12 hours, the fundus, or the top of the uterus, actually relaxes up. So as the uterus relaxes, the fundus actually moves up, okay, and it rises to about the level of the umbilicus. And then from that point, the fundus, or the uterus, starts to shrink down, and generally speaking, it tends to go down about 1 finger breadth or 1 centimeter per postpartum day. Okay. By about 10 days postpartum, the uterus enters the actual pelvis, okay, and it can no longer be palpated abdominally. And by about 6 weeks, the uterus has returned to a non-pregnant location, and now it weighs about 60 to 80 grams. Okay? And as you'll see in the next slide, the parus or multiparous uterus is going to retain some size and some weight compared to the nulliparous uterus. Okay, so if we look at up here, we see that one of these muscle fibers in the uterus, if we compare the pregnant size, which is really quite big, right, and we compare then the non-pregnant size to the parus non-pregnant muscle size. So you can see that the parus uterus contains muscle cells that are larger than the muscle cells seen in a woman who was never pregnant. Okay. And we see that also when we consider the return of the uterus to a non-pregnant state in a nulliparous woman that has a uterus that is smaller than the parus uterus. Okay. So it never completely returns to the same morphology, and also, as you can see, the body of the uterus has a larger proportion compared to the cervix, in relation to the cervix compared to the nulliparous uterus. Okay, so if you consider the entire uterus, the body makes up a greater proportion of the total uterus in the parus woman than in the nulliparous woman. Okay. And then if you consider the cervix actually never returns to the nulliparous state. Nulliparous state, the cervix is a small circular opening. In the parus cervix, the opening is a parus slit. Okay, so now immediately after delivery, we're talking about the cervix here. Immediately after delivery, as you can imagine, the cervix is thin, it's bruised, it's edematous, it has multiple lacerations. It's been through a lot. Over the next 12 to 18 hours, it shortens, it becomes firm, and over the next 2 to 3 days, it remains a little bit dilated. It tends to stay about 2 centimeters dilated. By 1 week, it tends to be maybe about 1 centimeter, and by about 10 to 12 days, it is not dilated at all. Okay? And the edema can persist between 3 to 4 months past labor and delivery. Okay, so the cervix really takes quite a while, as the uterus and the rest of the body takes quite a while to completely return, or completely heal. In terms of the vagina, after delivery, the vagina, again, as you can imagine, is edematous, it's relaxed, it has decreased tone. It also has lost some of its epithelial layers with the movement of the baby through the birth canal. By about 3 to 4 weeks, it tends to decrease in size. It develops the rugae, or the folds in the inner vaginal wall. The edema starts to disappear. By about 6 to 10 weeks, the vaginal epithelium regenerates. But just like the uterus, the parous vagina is not identical to the nulliparous vagina. So it retains some of its increase in size. Okay? And it could take between 4 to 6 months for the vagina to completely heal from a vaginal delivery. Now, the discharge that women experience postpartum is called lochia. And lochia varies in amount and color depending on how soon after labor you're observing it. So lochia immediately after labor and delivery is called lochia rubra. And it really, lochia rubra tends to persist for the first 2 to 4 days postpartum. And it's bright red, as it sounds. It contains mostly blood from the placental site. It could contain pieces of amnion and chorion. It could contain cellular elements from the decidua. It could even have some vernix and lanugo, some meconium. And it can appear sometimes as dark red or brown, and it has kind of a fleshy odor. And it's initially very sterile until the uterus starts to get recolonized by vaginal flora. Then by day 3 or 4, the lochia starts to change in color. It tends to get about this pink brownish color, and it's called lochia serosa. And this really reflects the move from sort of blood loss and removal of pregnancy elements to this lochia serosa is sort of the healing phase. It contains leukocytes and mucus, vaginal epithelium. It contains necrotic decidua. It can contain non-pathological bacteria. And it can be bloodstained for up to 3 to 4 weeks. Okay. And then finally, the lochia moves to a sort of yellow-whitish color, and it's called lochia alba. And really, it contains mostly leukocytes, some decidual cells, some mucus, some epithelial cells. And for all of these stages, I forgot to say that this lochia alba can last between 3 to 6 weeks. Okay. Now, for all of these stages, the total volume of lochia that's produced is somewhere between 150 to 400 milliliters, with an average of about 225. You tend to see greater volumes in multiparous women, and you tend to actually see lower volumes in women who are breastfeeding. And the thought is that the lower volume, and they also tend to have a shorter period of lochial flow, so they tend to have less flow and for a shorter duration. And the thought behind that is that in breastfeeding women, they're constantly getting waves of oxytocin into the bloodstream whenever they breastfeed their child, and that oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions, and that actually tends to increase the healing rate of the uterus. Okay. So while women who are breastfeeding tend to have less overall lochial volume and tend to have lochial flow over a shorter duration of time, during breastfeeding sessions, a woman might notice that she has an increase in lochial flow for that short duration of time. And that's again because of that uterine contraction stimulated by the release of oxytocin. Okay, so mom underwent a lot of changes in her physiological state with pregnancy, and so during the postpartum period, her body has to kind of adapt back to a non-pregnant state. And that's a tall order because her body changed a whole lot during pregnancy. So in terms of the cardiovascular system, if you remember, there was this pregnancy hypervolemia, about 50% increase in especially plasma volume. Now, during delivery, labor and delivery, this hypervolemia actually helped a lot with the tolerance of blood loss during childbirth. Now, the average blood loss with a vaginal delivery is about half a liter, and it could be up to a liter in cesarean deliveries. So that expansion of blood volume really helps offset that blood loss. But immediately after delivery, maternal cardiac output actually increases because the blood flow to the fetus and the placenta goes down because the fetus and the placenta is not there any longer. So more blood actually gets returned to the maternal heart. This increase in cardiac output persists for about 48 hours, but it returns to normal by about 6 to 12 weeks postpartum. So mom's plasma volume is going to return to normal fairly soon, actually, and it's going to be due to mostly significant diuresis and diaphoresis. Okay, so she's going to pee it out and she's going to sweat it out. So urinary output postpartum can be up to 3 liters a day, especially in the first 2 to 5 days. And that's going to be really helped by the withdrawal of placental renin. Remember, the placenta was putting out lots of renin that was stimulating the renin-angiotensin system and causing sodium and water retention. So that's all going to go away, and mom's going to pee out quite a lot of plasma. And then she's also going to sweat out a lot of plasma, so a lot of diaphoresis. Okay. In terms of hemostasis and coagulation, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for that to return to non-pregnant levels. Mom's white blood cells are elevated immediately after delivery, and it takes about 6 days for them to return to normal. Her hemoglobin and hematocrit, if you remember, hemoglobin concentration was low because of the hemodilution. Hematocrit was low again because of the hemodilution, and that tends to normalize between 4 to 6 weeks postpartum. There's also going to be some normalization of the GI tract. So you're going to have some lots of hunger and lots of thirst immediately postpartum, mostly because of all the energy expenditure during and also reduced food and fluid intake during childbirth. Constipation is a really common problem during the early postpartum period, both because of physiological reasons and also sort of mental reasons. The bowel and gastric tone is actually quite sluggish, both still from pregnancy because of the presence of progesterone, but also because of the sort of manipulation of the baby against the abdominal organs. You also have a relaxation of the abdominal wall because it was all stretched out from being pregnant, and that low abdominal wall tone sort of lowers colonic motility, and it causes sort of gas distension. The food restriction and fluid restriction during labor produces sort of small hard stools, which are hard to pass. And then on the sort of mental side of it, mom's got a lot of perineal trauma potentially, and she's anticipating a lot of pain during defecation. So she might actually be not all that willing to defecate, and that might cause withholding, and that can certainly increase the likelihood of constipation. So the use of stool softeners immediately postpartum is extremely important to try to avoid that postpartum constipation. So the first stools usually occur within the first 2-3 days, and normal bowel elimination tends to happen around 8 to 14 days. Now remember, a woman who's gone through a cesarean, this whole issue with constipation gets even more risky. So a woman with a cesarean's had abdominal surgery. She's going to have some issues of paralytic ileus because of that. She also is going to potentially be on an opioid painkillers, which increase the likelihood of constipation. Okay, and she might be dealing with more pain, which also might cause withholding and increase risk of constipation. Now, the urinary system, it went through a lot of changes during pregnancy. The kidneys are going to return to normal function by about 2 to 3 months after delivery. Okay. The dilation of the kidneys and the ureters that we saw during pregnancy takes about 6 to 8 weeks to completely resolve. And immediately after delivery, and for the first few days, you might see protein in the urine simply because of or at least in part because of this significant catabolic process involved in uterine involution, right? Autolysis of all of those myometrial cells, you're breaking down a lot of protein. The postpartum bladder continues to have an increased capacity and also a decreased muscle tone. Okay? So this increased capacity, decreased muscle tone increases the risk of a urinary stasis, okay? Which we all know increases the risk of urinary tract infections. During childbirth, the urethra, the bladder, and the tissue around the urinary meatus, the outlet of the urethra, becomes very edematous. You have some physical trauma as the head sort of passes underneath the bladder. That physical trauma can result in some diminished sensitivity to fluid pressure in the bladder, which essentially means that a woman has a full bladder, but she doesn't necessarily have the sensation for a need to void. Okay. Now, remember, increased capacity of her bladder, decreased muscle tone, decreased sensitivity. This is all increasing the risk of urinary stasis. Okay. So this is all also increasing the risk of urinary tract infections. And then on top of that, if the bladder does get overdistended, as it may, it can displace the uterus, and it can interfere with the muscle contractions that are needed for involution. Okay, and if the uterus is not contracting muscles adequately, you increase the risk of bleeding and postpartum hemorrhage. And the stress incontinence during pregnancy tends to improve within 3 months after birth. But this immediate postpartum period, the stress incontinence may get actually worse before it gets better. And now again, considering everything I just said about the risk of urinary stasis and infection, remember someone who has had, who's been catheterized during labor and delivery, whether because of an epidural or because of because of a cesarean section, this is going to increase the sort of decrease. It's going to cause the decreased muscle tone of the bladder to be worse, and it's going to further increase the risk for urinary stasis and infection.